Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Montana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. Far from the bustle of cities, nestled in the shadows of the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana, lies a place few dare to speak of, a site that has been all but erased from the collective memory of the region, yet echoes still haunt those secluded woods. What follows is the documented account of what would become known as the Blackwood Valley Incident, a grim discovery made in the autumn of 1910 that continues to disturb those who study the historical records of Ravalli County to this day. The year 1910 marked a period of transition for the American West. The frontier had officially closed 2 decades prior, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. Yet pockets of isolation remained throughout the mountainous regions of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. The Bitterroot Valley, with its fertile soil and abundant water, had attracted settlers since the 1870s, drawn by the promise of land and opportunity in what was still considered a wild territory. Among these early pioneers were families seeking not just prosperity, but separation, distance from the growing industrialization and social pressures of America's rapidly expanding cities. Ravalli County records from this period document a steady increase in homestead claims, particularly in the more remote valleys branching off from the main Bitterroot Valley. County surveys from 1880 through 1910 show a pattern of development concentrated along the primary waterways, with isolated homesteads scattered through the more challenging terrain. It was in one such remote location, approximately 12 miles northwest of Hamilton, that the Blackwood family established their homestead in 1881. According to land office records preserved in the county archives, Thomas Blackwood filed his claim on April 17, 1881, securing 160 acres of land that included a small valley floor suitable for cultivation and wooded slopes that provided timber, game, and natural boundaries. At the time of filing, Thomas was recorded as 32 years old, accompanied by his wife Eleanor, 28, and their infant son Robert. The family had traveled west from Pennsylvania, where Thomas had worked as a carpenter in the growing industrial city of Pittsburgh. What drove the Blackwoods to seek such isolation remains a matter of historical speculation. The few personal letters preserved in the Hamilton Historical Society collection suggest that Thomas had grown disillusioned with urban life. In a letter to his brother, dated November 1880, he wrote, "The air itself seems poisoned with smoke and ambition. Men hurry past one another without recognition, their eyes fixed only on accumulation. Eleanor and I seek cleaner breath and quieter purpose. The child should know a different world." This sentiment, a desire for separation from the perceived moral and physical contamination of industrial society, was not uncommon among certain settlers of the period. The historian Dr. Michael Reynolds, in his 1979 study, Frontier Isolationism, Montana's Solitary Homesteaders, identified a subset of Western settlers who sought not community but deliberate distance from it. Unlike the majority of pioneers who established towns and social networks, Reynolds wrote, these isolationists viewed separation itself as a form of virtue. They came not to build a new society, but to escape society altogether. The Blackwood family appears to have fit this pattern. Over their nearly 30 years of residence in the valley, they maintained minimal contact with the community of Hamilton. Tax records show regular payment of obligations, and merchant ledgers document periodic purchases of supplies that could not be produced on the homestead: salt, sugar, tools, fabric. But these transactions were infrequent and typically conducted by Thomas alone or occasionally accompanied by one of his sons. By 1910, the family had expanded to include 3 adult sons: Robert, 29, William, 26, and Joseph, 23, all born on the homestead. None had married or established separate households. Thomas's father, Jeremiah Blackwood, had joined the family in 1897 following the death of his wife in Pennsylvania. At the time of their disappearance, the household consisted of these 5 individuals, spanning 3 generations of the Blackwood line. The family's isolation, while notable, did not initially raise concerns in Hamilton. The vast distances and challenging terrain of the region made infrequent contact with remote homesteaders unremarkable. The Blackwoods maintained a productive apple orchard, supplemented by subsistence crops and livestock. According to agricultural records, their apple yield was considered exceptional for the region, with varieties specifically adapted to the shorter growing season and colder climate of the northern bitterroot. Records from 1905 show they had won recognition at the county fair for their Blackwood Winter Red variety, though none of the family attended the ceremony to accept the modest prize. County school records from the period indicate that none of the Blackwood sons received formal education in Hamilton. A letter from the county superintendent dated 1889 notes an unsuccessful attempt to include the Blackwood property in a proposed rural school district. Thomas's written response, preserved in county files, politely but firmly declined participation. We find ourselves adequately equipped to instruct our children in necessary knowledge. Distance makes regular attendance impractical, and our circumstances require their assistance in maintaining our livelihood. This self-sufficiency extended to medical care as well. Dr. Albert Thompson, Hamilton's physician from 1888 to 1914, recorded in his casebook only 2 interactions with the Blackwood family, a delivery consultation for Eleanor in 1887, presumably for Joseph's birth, and treatment of a broken arm for William in 1896. In both instances, Dr. Thompson traveled to the homestead rather than the family coming to town, and he noted in his records that Eleanor appeared to possess considerable practical medical knowledge and a substantial collection of herbal preparations. The family's religious practices similarly remained private. Unlike many settlers who participated in community church activities even when distances were considerable, the Blackwoods are absent from the membership records of Hamilton's Presbyterian, Methodist, and Catholic congregations. However, the inventory of Thomas's library conducted after their disappearance included a well-worn family Bible with extensive margin notes, suggesting some form of personal religious observance. This pattern of deliberate separation makes the family's disappearance both more and less mysterious. On one hand, their limited social integration meant fewer witnesses to any changes in behavior or circumstance that might have preceded their departure. On the other hand, their established preference for isolation makes their collective abandonment of a functioning homestead all the more puzzling. If separation from society was their goal, they had already achieved it in their remote valley. The first indication that something unusual had occurred came in mid-August 1910, when the family failed to make their customary monthly supply trip to Hamilton. Samuel Wilson, proprietor of Wilson's General Merchandise, noted in his business ledger on August 12, 1910, "No sign of T. Blackwood or Sons. Account remains unpaid for second month. Unusual." Wilson, who had supplied the Blackwoods for over 20 years, recognized the deviation from their otherwise reliable pattern. Wilson later told Sheriff Harrison that Thomas Blackwood's last visit to his store had occurred on June 14, 1910. During that visit, Thomas had purchased an unusual combination of items: 50 feet of heavy rope, 3 large canvas sheets, a set of drafting tools, and 20 pounds of salt. When Wilson inquired about these purchases, Thomas had explained simply that they were preparing for changes in the season. Given that summer had barely begun, Wilson found the response curious, but did not press further. By early September, the absence had become a topic of discussion among Hamilton merchants. Frederick Morgan, the local postmaster since 1902, had accumulated several weeks of uncollected mail for the family, primarily agricultural bulletins and a quarterly letter from Eleanor's sister in Pennsylvania. On September 18, 1910, Morgan dispatched his young assistant, Peter Collins, to deliver the mail directly to the Blackwood property and make inquiries about the family's welfare. Collins, 22 years old and new to the region, later described his journey to the remote homestead as increasingly unsettling. In his statement to Sheriff Harrison, preserved in the county records, he recalled, "The trail grew fainter the further I rode. The trees seemed to press in, and I had the queer feeling of being watched, though I saw no one. When I finally reached the clearing where the house stood, the silence was complete. No livestock sounds, no human activity. It felt as though the forest was holding its breath." The scene Collins discovered has become the defining image of the Blackwood mystery. His report, filed upon his return to Hamilton on September 18th and subsequently known in county files as the Collins Report, described the property as eerily vacant, yet showing no signs of hasty departure. The family home, a substantial two-story farmhouse built of local timber, stood with doors unlocked and windows intact. Inside, Collins found the kitchen table set for a meal that had never been eaten, with plates of food long since rotted away. The bedrooms appeared orderly, with clothing neatly folded and personal belongings arranged as if the occupants intended to return. Most peculiar, however, was what Collins found in the barn. The livestock, 2 horses, 3 cows, and a dozen chickens, had been meticulously cared for and then released into a fenced pasture with access to water and sufficient grazing land. According to his report, it appeared as if arrangements had been made for the animals' care despite the family's absence. This deliberate attention to the welfare of the livestock stood in stark contrast to the abandoned home. Collins noted additional details that would later prove significant. In Thomas's study, he found an open ledger with a partially completed entry dated August 3, 1910. Nearby lay a stack of hand-drawn maps of the surrounding mountains, marked with strange symbols along certain ridgelines. On Eleanor's work table in the parlor, Collins discovered 5 small cloth pouches containing what appeared to be dried herbs and small stones arranged in a perfect circle. These items were documented in his report but not removed from the property. Collins returned to Hamilton and reported his findings to Sheriff James Harrison, who had served as county sheriff since 1906 and was known for his methodical approach to law enforcement. Harrison, concerned by the unusual circumstances, organized a more thorough investigation of the property the following day, September 19, 1910. The party included Harrison, 2 deputies, Frank Simmons and Charles Weber, Dr. Marcus Fletcher, the county physician, and Collins as guide. The weather that day, according to meteorological records preserved in county archives, was unseasonably cool and overcast, with intermittent light rain, conditions that Deputy Simmons later described as fitting the mood of our grim errand. The party arrived at the Blackwood homestead shortly after noon, finding it exactly as Collins had described. The subsequent report, filed on September 20, 1910, and preserved in county archives, marked the beginning of what would become an increasingly disturbing mystery. Sheriff Harrison's initial assessment expanded on Collins's observations. The Blackwood home contained no signs of struggle or violence. Food stores in the cellar had been organized and inventoried with unusual precision. A ledger found in Thomas Blackwood's study contained entries up to August 3, 1910, the presumed date of the family's disappearance. The final entry, written in Thomas's distinctive hand, read simply, "Preparations complete. We leave together at dawn." Harrison conducted a thorough inspection of the property, documenting each building and its contents in meticulous detail. The family's personal possessions remained largely undisturbed: clothing and wardrobes, tools in the workshop, Eleanor's loom still threaded for weaving. In Thomas's study, Harrison found a collection of books on subjects ranging from practical agriculture to more esoteric topics: astronomy, geometry, indigenous languages, and natural philosophy. Several volumes contained extensive margin notes in Thomas's handwriting, particularly those dealing with patterns in nature and cosmological systems. What confused investigators was the apparent contradiction between this statement and the physical evidence. The family's wagon remained in the barn. Their 2 riding horses had been released into the pasture with the other livestock. No significant clothing or supplies appeared to be missing from the home. If the Blackwoods had departed voluntarily, they had done so on foot and with minimal provisions, a scenario that made little sense given the rugged terrain surrounding their property. Deputy Frank Simmons noted in his personal journal, later donated to the County Historical Society, "The house feels like its occupants stepped out moments ago and might return at any time. Yet the dust and the spoiled food tell a different story. The place has been empty for weeks, yet nothing is missing that a traveling family would take. Where does one go in these mountains without supplies, without horses?" Dr. Fletcher conducted an examination of the property for any signs of illness or contamination that might explain a sudden evacuation. He found nothing to suggest disease. The water sources were clean, the food stores unspoiled beyond normal decay, and no evidence of rodent or insect infestation. In his medical report, Fletcher noted, "The home presents as unusually sanitary for a rural dwelling of this period. The root cellar is well ventilated, the kitchen scrupulously organized. I detect no environmental cause for abandonment." The investigation took a more ominous turn when Sheriff Harrison and his deputies discovered a cleared area approximately half a mile from the main house, deep in the woods that bordered the northern edge of the Blackwood property. According to the official report, they found what appeared to be a recently established camp of unusual configuration. The site consisted of a circular clearing approximately 30 feet in diameter, at the center of which remained the ashes of a large fire. The discovery was made when Deputy Weber, following what appeared to be a newly created trail marked with small stone cairns, ventured beyond the established boundaries of the cultivated property. The trail led steadily northward, ascending gradually into increasingly dense forest before opening suddenly onto the cleared site. Weber's initial reaction, recorded in his statement, was one of immediate unease. The clearing was too perfect, too deliberate. No natural forest opening forms such a precise circle, nor would routine camping create such a symmetrical arrangement. It struck me at once as having been created for some specific purpose beyond practical necessity. Around this central fire pit, investigators discovered 5 crude shelters arranged in a perfect pentagon. Each shelter consisted of a platform of branches elevated approximately 3 feet off the ground, covered with a simple roof of pine boughs. Sheriff Harrison noted that each platform contained a single blanket, neatly folded, and a small wooden box. The contents of these boxes would become the most disturbing element of the entire investigation. Each box contained identical items: a handwritten note, a small vial of what appeared to be apple cider vinegar, a lock of hair, and a personal item belonging to each family member. In Thomas's box, a pocket watch passed down from his grandfather. In Eleanor's, a silver brooch containing a daguerreotype of her parents. Each son's box contained a personal tool: Robert's pruning knife, William's whittling blade, Joseph's compass. Jeremiah's box held his wedding ring. The notes, all written in Thomas Blackwood's handwriting, contained the same message: "We leave together, so no one will be blamed. The land will keep our secret." This cryptic statement, repeated 5 times on 5 separate pieces of paper, has been the subject of considerable historical debate. Harrison ordered each box and its contents collected as evidence, a decision later criticized by some researchers as possibly disturbing what may have been intended as a ritual arrangement. The boxes themselves were crafted of local pine, freshly made judging by the smell of resin still present, with simple hinged lids and no locks or fasteners. The uniformity of their construction suggested they had been built specifically for this purpose. Analysis of the vial's contents conducted by Dr. Fletcher upon return to Hamilton confirmed them to contain apple cider vinegar with traces of herbs that he identified as primarily rosemary and thyme, common plants that grew in Eleanor's garden. The locks of hair visually matched the known hair colors of family members, though no forensic confirmation was possible with the technology of the period. What made the discovery all the more unsettling was the methodical, almost ritualistic nature of the camp's arrangement. Dr. Marcus Fletcher, the county physician who accompanied the investigation team, observed in his personal journal, later donated to the County Historical Society, that the precision of the camp's layout suggests not panic or crisis, but calm deliberation. Whatever led the Blackwoods to establish this site and presumably to vanish from it was not the result of sudden madness, but of careful planning. Further examination of the site revealed additional peculiarities. The circumference of the clearing had been marked with small cairns of stones placed at precise intervals. Between these cairns, investigators found shallow trenches filled with a mixture of soil and what appeared to be ashes from the Blackwoods hearth. Dr. Fletcher noted that the entire arrangement formed a perfect circle, as precisely measured as if laid out by surveying equipment. Given the Blackwoods' isolation and limited contact with the outside world, the purpose or inspiration for such an arrangement remained baffling. The central fire pit contained the remains of a substantial blaze, with ash deposits suggesting a fire maintained for several hours. Among the ashes, deputies discovered small fragments of paper, too charred to yield any legible content, and several metal buttons identified as likely coming from clothing. Dr. Fletcher collected these fragments, noting in his report that they appeared to be deliberately consigned to the flames rather than accidentally dropped. Perhaps most disturbing was Deputy Simmons's discovery along the perimeter of the clearing. At 5 equidistant points, corresponding to the positions of the 5 shelters, he found small hand-dug holes approximately 6 inches deep. Each hole had been refilled with soil mixed with what appeared to be salt. When excavated during the investigation, each was found to contain a small cloth packet. Inside these packets were 5 identical items: a polished black stone, a sprig of dried pine needles, a hand-drawn symbol on paper, a small amount of what appeared to be apple seeds, and a tiny portion of what Dr. Fletcher tentatively identified as dried blood. Sheriff Harrison ordered an extensive search of the surrounding area, extending outward from the camp in concentric circles. Despite deploying nearly 20 men over the course of a week, no trace of the family was discovered. No bodies, no additional campsites, no discarded possessions, no signs of violence or struggle. The forest, dense with pine and fir, had yielded to early autumn by the time of the investigation, its floor carpeted with needles that revealed no footprints or disturbances beyond the camp itself. Deputy Weber, who led several of the search parties, noted in his report a curious phenomenon. Beyond the clearing, approximately 50 yards to the north, all members of the search party reported an unusual sensation, a pressure in the ears, similar to that experienced at high altitude despite no significant elevation change. Several men refused to proceed further, citing inexplicable unease. I myself felt a distinct reluctance to continue in that direction, though I can identify no rational cause for such hesitation. The investigation continued for several weeks, with search parties combing the surrounding mountains for any trace of the missing family. No bodies were ever discovered. No evidence of violence was found. The Blackwoods had simply vanished, leaving behind an undisturbed home, carefully tended livestock, and a mysterious camp that defied simple explanation. Investigators consulted with local hunters and trappers familiar with the terrain, questioning whether the family could have fallen victim to natural hazards or predators. Martin Oakley, who had trapped in the region for over 30 years, provided a statement expressing skepticism about such explanations. No bear or mountain lion takes 5 people without leaving sign. No ravine swallows a family without trace. I've tracked wounded elk for 20 miles through these mountains. If the Blackwoods died in these woods, something of them would remain to be found. By late October, with resources strained and no new evidence emerging, Sheriff Harrison officially classified the case as an unexplained disappearance. In his final report, dated October 30th, 1910, he wrote, "It is the determination of this office that the Blackwood family departed their property voluntarily for reasons unknown. Despite extensive search efforts, no evidence of foul play has been discovered. The unusual nature of their departure remains unexplained." Harrison concluded his report with a personal observation that was unusual for an official document of the period. "In my 17 years of law enforcement, I have encountered cases of murder, suicide, accidental death, and intentional disappearance. The Blackwood matter fits none of these categories neatly. 5 persons do not vanish without trace unless by design. Yet the nature of that design, its purpose and execution, remains opaque. Perhaps some mysteries are not meant to be solved by conventional means." For many in the community, this conclusion was far from satisfying. Rumors began to circulate about what might have befallen the family. Some suggested that Thomas Blackwood, known for his stern religiosity, had led his family on some misguided spiritual quest into the wilderness. The Hamilton Ministerial Association, comprising the town's Protestant clergy, issued a statement suggesting that the Blackwoods had fallen victim to dangerous religious deviation. Reverend Simeon Parker of the First Presbyterian Church speculated publicly that Thomas had abandoned sound doctrine for wilderness mysticism, citing the unusual camp arrangement as evidence of pagan rituals unbecoming to a Christian household. Such theories gained credence when Ezra Johnson, a E.E. Hamilton blacksmith who had occasionally repaired tools for the Blackwoods, recalled a strange conversation with Thomas approximately 3 months before the disappearance. Others whispered about family tensions that may have erupted into violence, with the surviving member or members concealing the evidence. According to Johnson's statement to the Hamilton Weekly Chronicle, Thomas had questioned him about indigenous beliefs regarding thin places, locations where, according to some traditions, the boundary between worlds was more permeable. Johnson, having no knowledge of such concepts, had dismissed the inquiry, but in retrospect found it disquietingly relevant to the family's subsequent vanishing. Arthur Jenkins, editor of the Hamilton Weekly Chronicle, published an editorial on November 5, 1910, questioning the thoroughness of the investigation. 5 souls vanished from our county, and our officials seem content to file papers and move on. Are we to believe that an entire family walked into the wilderness by choice without provisions or purpose? Or does some darker truth lie hidden in those remote woods, a truth our authorities lack the will or ability to uncover? Sheriff Harrison defended his department's efforts, noting that over 200 man-hours had been dedicated to the search, covering a radius of nearly 5 miles from the Blackwood property. Short of deforesting the entire mountain range, he was quoted as saying in the November 12th edition of the Chronicle, "We have exhausted every reasonable investigative avenue. The Blackwoods are gone, whether by choice or by some misfortune that has left no trace. Their fate, I fear, will remain between them and their maker." More sensationalistic theories emerged as news of the disappearance spread beyond Raleigh County. The Butte Daily Miner published an article on November 8, 1910, suggesting that the family had fallen victim to anarchist revolutionaries, supposedly establishing secret camps in remote mountain regions. This baseless speculation, reflecting broader social anxieties of the period, was firmly rejected by Sheriff Harrison, who noted that no evidence of other human presence had been found in the vicinity of the Blackwood property. The most persistent theory, however, centered on the land itself. The Blackwood property occupied a valley that had featured prominently in local indigenous legends. According to accounts collected by anthropologist Dr. Rebecca Stern in 1921, the native Salish people had traditionally avoided that particular valley, believing it to be a place where the boundary between worlds grows thin. Whether such beliefs influenced the Blackwoods or their fate remains speculation. Dr. Stern's field notes, preserved in the University of Montana archives, record conversations with Salish elder Joseph Bitterroot, who referred to the area as the Silent Valley in their native language. According to Bitterroot, tribal hunters had for generations avoided the northern reaches of what later became the Blackwood property, believing that those who ventured too deeply into its forests risked being called away by voices that seemed to emanate from the land itself. Those who hear the voices become restless, Bitterroot told Stern. They speak of another place that waits beyond the trees. Some go to look for it. They do not return. Bitterroot further explained that the area had been the site of periodic ceremonies conducted by tribal medicine people who would create circular arrangements of stones to strengthen the boundary between worlds. These ceremonies had ceased after a European settlement displaced the Salish from the region, leading some tribal elders to express concern that the boundary would weaken without proper maintenance. When shown a sketch of the Blackwood camp arrangement, Bitterroot reportedly exhibited visible distress, stating through an interpreter, "They built a doorway, not a barrier. They invited crossing." Such accounts, while compelling from an anthropological perspective, were dismissed by most contemporary investigators as superstition unrelated to the Blackwood case. Sheriff Harrison made no reference to indigenous beliefs in his official reports, focusing instead on the physical evidence and the methodical nature of the family's apparent departure. In the weeks following the conclusion of the official investigation, the Blackwood property stood vacant, an object of both curiosity and unease for the surrounding community. Despite Harrison's attempts to secure the site, reports emerged of unauthorized visitors, some drawn by morbid fascination, others allegedly seeking to collect souvenirs of the mysterious disappearance. On November 22, 1910, Harrison dispatched Deputy Weber to install more secure locks on the home and outbuildings, an action that proved only temporarily effective in deterring trespassers. In December 1910, Thomas Blackwood's brother Daniel arrived from Pennsylvania to claim the property as next of kin. According to county records, he spent less than a week at the homestead before returning east, leaving instructions with a Hamilton attorney to sell the land at any reasonable offer. Before departing, Daniel authorized the donation of several family items to the County Historical Society, including Eleanor's loom, Thomas's agricultural journals, and several hand-drawn maps of the property. Notably absent from this donation were any of the items collected from the mysterious camp, which remained in Sheriff Harrison's custody as potential evidence. Daniel Blackwood's brief statement to the Hamilton Weekly Chronicle offered little insight into the family's disappearance. "My brother was always of an independent mind," he told the newspaper. "I cannot speak to his final intentions or the circumstances of his departure. I can say only that I find no evidence of foul play, and that Thomas was not a man to act without purpose." When questioned about the strange camp, Daniel declined to speculate, saying only that some family matters are private, even in their mystery. The property remained on the market for nearly 3 years without attracting a buyer. Local farmers and ranchers, despite the obvious value of the established orchard and cleared land, seemed reluctant to take possession of a place associated with such an unsettling mystery. In 1914, the county records show that the property was finally purchased by the Northern Pacific Railway for inclusion in a timber reserve, though no logging was ever conducted in the area. A curious footnote to this period appears in the journal of Dr. Fletcher, who recorded a visit to the property in June 1913, shortly before its sale. Accompanied by Deputy Weber, Fletcher had intended to collect additional soil samples from the campsite for further analysis. His entry describes an unexpected discovery. The clearing has begun to reclaim itself as nature will, yet the pentagon pattern remains discernible. Most remarkable, however, was our finding at the center, where the fire pit had been. 5 saplings, pine precisely equidistant from each other, have taken root in a perfect circle. Weber assures me no such planting was done during or after the investigation. The symmetry appears natural, yet defies probability. The mystery might have faded entirely from public memory had it not been for an unexpected development nearly 50 years later. In 1958, during the construction of a Forest Service road several miles north of the former Blackwood property, workers uncovered a remarkable artifact that reignited interest in the long-forgotten case. Buried beneath a cairn of stones, the workers discovered a sealed mason jar containing a journal. The journal's leather cover bore the initials J.B., presumably Jeremiah Blackwood, the elderly father of Thomas. The contents of this journal, now preserved in the Montana Historical Society archives, provide the only first-hand account of the events leading up to the family's disappearance. Forest Service employee Richard Caldwell, who first discovered the jar while operating a bulldozer to clear the road path, described it in his initial report as deliberately buried and marked, as if whoever placed it there intended for it to be found eventually. The cairn had been constructed with care, the stones fitted together in a manner that had preserved the jar despite nearly 50 years of Montana winters. Caldwell noted that the cairn was positioned directly beside a game trail that showed signs of regular use, suggesting it had been placed where future human traffic was likely, if infrequent. The discovery was reported to Forest Service archaeologist Dr. Margaret Wilson, who supervised the journal's careful extraction and initial preservation. Her preliminary report, dated July 12, 1958, noted, "The artifact appears authentic to the early 20th century period, with paper quality, binding techniques, and ink consistent with that era. The handwriting maintains consistency throughout, suggesting a single author. The content relates directly to the historically documented Blackwood family disappearance of 1910, providing potential new evidence in this long, cold case." The journal entries begin in April 1910 and continue until August 2nd, the day before the family's presumed departure. The early entries describe typical farm activities, planting, repairs to outbuildings, concerns about rainfall. Jeremiah, at 78 years old, apparently maintained the journal as both a record of farm operations and a personal account of his thoughts and observations. His handwriting, while showing signs of age, remains legible throughout, indicating a man still in possession of his faculties. The April entries focus primarily on the apple orchard, noting blossoming times and weather conditions. Jeremiah expresses concern about late frosts, but notes that Thomas has developed a system of smudge pots that has proven effective in protecting the blossoms. He describes his grandsons with evident pride: Robert's skill with grafting, William's talent for construction, Joseph's developing abilities as a hunter. The family is portrayed as industrious, harmonious, and self-sufficient. On April 22nd, Jeremiah records, "A peculiar storm last night. No thunder or lightning, but the air itself seemed to vibrate. The house timbers hummed like Eleanor's tuning fork. None of us slept soundly. T rose before dawn and walked the north boundary, returned silent and thoughtful." The first hint of anything unusual appears in an entry dated May 17, 1910. "Strange sounds from the north woods last night. T says it was only wind in the high branches, but it seemed more purposeful to my ear. Like distant music, almost, but no melody I've ever heard." Jeremiah dismisses his own observation in the next line, attributing it to an old man's fancy, and noting that the ears, like the eyes, play tricks when youth has passed. Yet the reference to unusual sounds recurs with increasing frequency. On May 23rd, he writes, "The music came again at sunset. Eleanor heard it too this time, looked at me with such surprise. 'Like voices,' she said, 'but not speaking words I know.' T claims to hear nothing, but I catch him listening, head tilted toward the north woods when he thinks no one watches." By mid-June, however, the tone of the entries begins to shift. Jeremiah makes repeated references to disturbances in the north woods and voices on the wind. Initially, he attributes these phenomena to his aging mind and failing senses. On June 21st, he writes, "The voices came again at dusk. I tried to wake William to listen, but by the time he joined me on the porch, they had fallen silent. He humors me, but I see doubt in his eyes. Perhaps it is only memory playing its cruel games. A significant entry appears on June 28th. Joseph came to me privately today, asked if I still heard the sounds from the north. When I admitted I did, relief flooded his young face. "Grandfather," he said, "I've been walking toward them. Each time I get closer, but never quite reach the source." I cautioned him about wandering too far alone. These mountains can disorient even experienced woodsmen. He promised care, but said they're calling to us specifically. I'm certain of it. The entry dated July 7, 1910, marks a significant turning point. Jeremiah writes, T has finally admitted he hears them too. Not just the old man's fancy after all. The voices call from beyond the ridge, always at dusk. William spent the night in the woods, returned pale and quiet. Says we must listen more carefully. From this point, the journal documents an increasingly collective family preoccupation with the mysterious phenomena. On July 10th, Jeremiah records, "Family council after supper. All 5 of us now acknowledge the voices. T says we've been chosen for some purpose." Robert expressed skepticism, always the practical one, but even he cannot deny what we all hear. Eleanor suggests we research native beliefs about these mountains. T already has, it seems, has been reading his Salish texts with new purpose. Subsequent entries document an apparent change in the family's behavior. Farm work continued, but Jeremiah notes that his son and grandsons began spending evenings in Thomas's study, poring over old maps of the region and engaging in long, hushed conversations. By late July, Jeremiah writes of Thomas making regular journeys to the North Woods, returning with specimens that are never described in detail. On July 17th, a troubling entry appears. "Robert and T argued today. Our questions whether we should answer the calling at all. Says ancient wisdom warns against voices that summon from unfamiliar places. T grew stern, reminded him that all new worlds begin as unfamiliar. We didn't cross a continent to cling to old limitations," he said. The matter ended there, but disquiet remains. On July 22nd, he records, "T brought Eleanor to listen at the ridgeline today. She heard nothing at first, then suddenly gasped and gripped his arm. She's been quiet since their return, working at her loom, but speaking little. When I asked what she heard, she only said, 'It's beautiful, Father, like nothing in this world.'" The entries grow increasingly preoccupied with the voices and their effect on the family. On July 25th, Jeremiah writes, "Joseph spoke at dinner of the other place. Says he can almost see it when he closes his eyes, a valley like our own, but somehow more vibrant, more real. Robert argued that it's merely dreams brought on by too much listening for what may not exist. T silenced them both, saying, 'We must be certain before we decide.'" A disturbing observation appears on July 27th, found Eleanor weeping in the kitchen before dawn. When I asked the cause, she said she feared separation. "What if some hear the call more strongly than others?" she asked. "What if our family is divided by different capacities to perceive?" I had no comfort to offer, for the same thought has troubled my sleep. By the final week of July, Jeremiah records that Thomas had begun marking trees along a path leading from the homestead to the ridgeline, where the voices were supposedly heard. On July 29th, he writes, "Spent the day gathering stones for T's project. My old hands ache from the work, but there is comfort in purpose. He says the circle must be precise. A doorway, he calls it, though to where he will not say directly." The most unsettling entries come in the final days before the disappearance. On July 30th, Jeremiah writes, "The decision has been made. T says we have been chosen to understand. The land has secrets older than our settlement, older than memory. We will go to meet it on its terms." The following day's entry simply states, "Preparations underway. Eleanor weeps but does not object. The boys work with purpose I have not seen before." On August 1st, a particularly poignant passage appears. "We gathered in the parlor tonight. shared memories of our life in this valley, 30 years of Blackwoods working this soil, 3 sons born under this roof. We are not abandoning our home, T. told us, but expanding our understanding of home. He speaks with such certainty. I wish I shared it completely. The final entry, dated August 1910, reads, "Camp is prepared according to the pattern. T says it must be precise, 5 points around the center, just as they showed him. Tomorrow we go together at first light. T insists we leave no trace of struggle or flight. No one is to be blamed for what we freely choose. I am afraid, but more afraid to stay behind alone. I leave this record buried where a traveler might one day find it. Let it be known the Blackwoods were neither taken nor driven away. We go willingly toward the voices, 5 souls stepping beyond the understood world. Whether wisdom or folly guides us, only the land knows." This journal, authenticated by handwriting analysis and paper dating, casts the Blackwood disappearance in an entirely new and more disturbing light. It suggests that the family's departure was indeed voluntary, but motivated by experiences or beliefs far outside conventional understanding. What voices did they hear? What pattern did they follow in constructing their strange camp? These questions remain unanswered. The discovery of Jeremiah's journal generated renewed interest in the long-dormant case. The Montana Historical Society organized a multidisciplinary conference in the fall of 1958, bringing together historians, anthropologists, psychologists, and law enforcement officials to re-examine the Blackwood disappearance in light of this new evidence. The proceedings, published under the title "The Blackwood Mystery Reconsidered," reveal the diversity of professional interpretations the case inspired. Dr. Alan Peterson, professor of psychology at Montana State University, reviewed the journal in 1960 and offered a clinical interpretation. In his subsequent paper, Folie à Famille, the Blackwood Case Study, he suggested that the journal documented a classic case of shared psychotic disorder, likely initiated by Thomas Blackwood and gradually accepted by his isolated and dependent family members. Peterson theorized that Thomas, perhaps suffering from the early stages of a degenerative neurological condition, experienced auditory hallucinations that he interpreted as communications from another realm. The family's extreme isolation and close interdependence created conditions in which the delusion could be transmitted and reinforced without external reality testing. This clinical assessment, while persuasive to many, failed to account for several aspects of the case, particularly the methodical preparation of the campsite and the family's careful attention to their livestock's welfare. As historian Margaret Campbell noted in her 1972 analysis, the Blackwoods did not behave as we expect people in the grip of psychosis to behave. Their actions show planning, consideration, and a collective purpose that suggests conviction rather than confusion. Anthropologist Dr. Robert Lightfoot proposed an alternative interpretation, suggesting that the Blackwoods had encountered and embraced indigenous spiritual concepts through their decades of isolation in traditionally Salish territory. Prolonged immersion in a landscape imbued with specific cultural meanings can lead to a form of spiritual osmosis, he argued, particularly when individuals are separated from their own cultural reinforcement systems. The Blackwoods may have experienced a genuine perceptual phenomenon associated with the specific geological or electromagnetic properties of that location, then interpreted it through a syncretic framework combining their Christian background with absorbed indigenous concepts. The discovery of Jeremiah's journal led to renewed interest in the case. In 1962, Dr. Alan Shepard of Missoula University led a small archaeological investigation of the former Blackwood property, by then long abandoned and reclaimed by forest. His team located the remains of both the farmhouse, which had partially collapsed, and the mysterious camp in the North Woods. Soil analysis at the campsite revealed unusually high levels of iron oxide, giving the earth a distinctive reddish hue, not typical of the region's geology. The original pentagon pattern of the shelters was still discernible, though the structures themselves had largely deteriorated. Shepard's team found evidence of the central fire pit and the stone cairns marking the perimeter of the clearing. Most intriguingly, they discovered that each of the 5 shelters had been positioned precisely in alignment with significant geographical features: mountain peaks, river confluences, and prominent rock formations visible from the site. In his field notes, Shepard observed, "The geometric precision of the camp layout suggests knowledge of surveying principles that seem incongruous with the Blackwood's isolated farming life. The alignments with landscape features demonstrate either remarkable coincidence or deliberate design, based on specialized knowledge." He further noted that the site had been placed at a location where 5 natural game trails converged, creating a natural pentagon in the forest itself that the camp's design appeared to mirror. Geologist Dr. Harold Simmons, who accompanied the Shepard expedition, noted several unusual characteristics of the site. The clearing sits directly above a significant geomagnetic anomaly, with compass readings showing deviations of up to 15 degrees. Subsurface scanning suggests a high concentration of iron-bearing minerals approximately 20 feet beneath the camp's center. Whether the Blackwoods were aware of these geological features is unknown, but the precise placement of their camp directly above this anomaly strikes me as unlikely to be coincidental. Another remarkable discovery came when botanist Dr. Eliza Montgomery examined the vegetation reclaiming the camp clearing. "The succession pattern is highly unusual," she reported. "Typically, abandoned clearings in this forest type are recolonized by a predictable sequence of species. This site, however, displays a unique pattern of recolonization, with 5 distinct vegetation communities arranging themselves in a radial pattern from the center. Without anthropogenic intervention, such a distribution would be statistically improbable, suggesting either deliberate planting or some localized environmental factor influencing plant distribution." Dr. Shepard's report, published in the Journal of Montana History in 1963, concluded with a sobering assessment. The Blackwood case resists conventional historical analysis. The physical evidence suggests a family that voluntarily walked away from their established life to pursue some alternative purpose or destination. The ritualistic elements of their departure, the camp's pentagon design, the identical notes and relics, point to a shared belief or experience that remains beyond our current understanding. The Shepard expedition also recovered several additional artifacts from the remains of the Blackwood home, including Thomas's personal library. The collection, consisting of 27 volumes, was unremarkable except for 3 texts: an 1887 translation of ancient Salish myths, a treatise on geomagnetic anomalies in the Rocky Mountain region, and a hand-bound collection of drawings depicting geometric patterns with notations in what appeared to be Thomas's handwriting. These materials, currently housed in the Montana Historical Society archives, have been studied by various researchers seeking clues to the family's mindset and motivations. The drawings, in particular, have attracted significant scholarly attention. They depict a series of increasingly complex geometric arrangements, beginning with simple circles and progressing to intricate overlapping pentagons and spirals. Notations beside the drawings include calculations of angles and distances, along with fragmentary phrases that suggest Thomas was developing some form of personal cosmology. "The pattern repeats at every scale," reads one note. "What is above corresponds to what is below," states another. "The land knows itself through us," declares a third. Most intriguing is a drawing dated June 1910, showing a detailed topographical rendering of the Northwoods with 5 intersecting lines converging at a single point, precisely where the camp would later be established. Beside this drawing, Thomas had written, "The confluence of pathways, where the world speaks clearly." The precision of this map, created before the camp's construction, suggests a level of premeditation that challenges theories of sudden psychosis or impulsive decision-making. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, professor of comparative religion at the University of Washington, studied these materials in 1975 and noted striking parallels to both indigenous spiritual practices and esoteric European traditions. In her analysis, Convergent Cosmologies, the Blackwood Synthesis, she suggested that Thomas had developed a unique synthetic belief system that combined elements of Salish spirituality, European mysticism, and his own observations of natural patterns in the isolated mountain environment. The Blackwoods appear to have been engaged in a form of spiritual practice that defies easy categorization, Warren wrote. The Pentagon arrangement of their camp, the ritualistic presentation of personal items, and the cryptic references in Thomas's notes suggest a ceremony of transition, not in the Christian sense of death and resurrection, but something more akin to the indigenous concept of world-walking, moving between planes of existence while still embodied. Such interpretations remain speculative, of course. The historical record provides evidence of what the Blackwoods did, their methodical preparations, their carefully arranged camp, their deliberate departure, but not why they did it or what became of them afterward. The physical evidence suggests intention and purpose, not confusion or coercion, yet the nature of that purpose remains obscure. The case returned to obscurity until 1968, when novelist James Farrell published The Beckoning Dark, a fictionalized account of the Blackwood disappearance. Though Farrell's novel took significant liberties with the historical record, its publication spurred renewed interest in the actual case. Several amateur investigators attempted to locate the precise site of the Blackwood farm and the mysterious camp, but by then, forest growth had obscured most remaining evidence. Farrell's novel portrayed the Blackwoods as victims of a malevolent force emanating from the land itself, gradually driving them to madness and self-destruction. This lurid interpretation, while popular with readers, bore little resemblance to the methodical preparations and apparent collectivity of purpose documented in the historical record. Nevertheless, the novel's success brought the real Blackwood case back into public consciousness, inspiring a new generation of investigators and theorists. The novel's publication coincided with broader cultural interest in alternative spirituality and consciousness expansion, lending the Blackwood case a new resonance with contemporary audiences. Several unauthorized expeditions to the former Blackwood property were documented in the late 1960s, prompting the Forest Service to issue public warnings about the hazards of the remote terrain and the legal restrictions on archaeological disturbance of the site. Perhaps the most intriguing postscript to the Blackwood Valley incident came in the form of an anonymous letter received by the Ravalli County Historical Society in 1969. The letter, postmarked from Seattle, claimed to be from a grandchild of Robert Blackwood, one of Thomas's sons who disappeared in 1910. The writer stated that Robert had, in fact, returned from the journey and had established a new identity in Washington state, living there until his death in 1952. The letter read, in part, "My grandfather spoke little of what happened that August morning. He would say only that the family had crossed over together and that he alone had lost courage and turned back. He wandered for weeks, he told me, before finding his way to a logging camp near the Idaho border. Fearing questions he couldn't answer, he took a new name and built a new life, but the memory of what he had glimpsed on the other side haunted him until his death." The letter continued. "He told me once, when very old and fevered with his final illness, that they had found a way to step sideways, out of the world we know. The air shimmered," he said, "and through it I could see the same forest, but more vivid, more real somehow. Father and mother stepped through without hesitation. Joseph and William followed. I began to cross, but faltered at the last moment, overwhelmed by sudden terror. When I turned back, the doorway was gone, and I was alone in the ordinary world." According to this account, Robert had spoken very little about what happened to his family, saying only that they had crossed over, and that he alone had lost courage and turned back. The letter provided no verifiable details, and attempts to identify the sender proved unsuccessful. Most historians consider it likely to be a hoax, though some researchers remain intrigued by its specific references to details of the Blackwood case that were not widely publicized. Dr. Richard Cooper, writing in the Journal of Western Mysteries in 1971, argued for the letter's authenticity based on its reference to the 5 points around the center, a detail from Jeremiah's journal that had not been included in Farrell's novel or most newspaper accounts of the case. The letter writer either had access to the original journal, Cooper wrote, or received this information from someone who did, possibly Robert Blackwood himself. Others have pointed out that the journal had been available to researchers at the Montana Historical Society since 1960, and that determined hoaxers could have accessed this information. The debate remains unresolved, with the letter itself now preserved alongside other Blackwood case documents in the county archives, another enigmatic piece of a puzzle that may never be completed. What then are we to make of the Blackwood Valley incident more than a century later? The documented facts tell us that 5 people, an entire family, vanished from their isolated homestead after carefully arranging their affairs and constructing a strange camp in the nearby woods. They left behind cryptic messages, suggesting a voluntary departure undertaken collectively for reasons they chose not to explain clearly. The discovered journal of Jeremiah Blackwood suggests that the family believed they were responding to some form of communication or phenomenon centered in the forests north of their property, something that gradually convinced even the initially skeptical members of the family. The precise nature of this phenomenon remains unknown. Rational explanations have been proposed over the years. Some historians suggest that Thomas Blackwood, perhaps suffering from deteriorating mental health, developed delusions that eventually infected his isolated family members, a phenomenon sometimes called folia familiae in psychiatric literature. Others propose that the family may have encountered environmental toxins, perhaps from their own apple orchard, that induced hallucinations or paranoia. Professor James Harrington of the University of Colorado suggested in a 1983 paper that the family might have been affected by ergot fungus, a natural contaminant that can cause hallucinations and has been linked to historical cases of mass psychosis. The Blackwoods apple orchard could have harbored ergot-infected wild grasses, Harrington theorized. Consumption of contaminated grain products could induce precisely the type of auditory and visual hallucinations described in Jeremiah's journal. This theory gained some support when soil samples from the former orchard, tested in 1985, showed traces consistent with historical ergot presence. However, as Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a toxicologist who reviewed the evidence in 1990, pointed out, ergot poisoning typically produces acute, debilitating symptoms, not the sustained, coherent planning evidenced by the Blackwoods preparations. It remains difficult to attribute their complex, coordinated actions to toxin-induced delirium. Yet these explanations struggle to account for the methodical nature of the family's preparations, the careful attention to their livestock's welfare, and the ritualistic arrangement of the campsite. Whatever drove the Blackwoods into the wilderness that August morning in 1910, it appears to have been embraced by all 5 family members with a shared sense of purpose. Dr. Thomas Jenkins of the University of Montana's Department of Anthropology has suggested that the Blackwoods may have been influenced by indigenous beliefs absorbed through their decades of isolation in a landscape rich with Native American history. The Bitterroot Valley had been home to the Salish for countless generations before European settlement, Jenkins wrote in his 2001 study. Their spiritual understanding of the land, its patterns, voices, and portals, persisted in local lore. The Blackwoods, separated from mainstream European American culture and deeply attuned to their immediate environment, may have developed a syncretic belief system that incorporated these indigenous perspectives. This interpretation gains some support from Thomas Blackwood's library, which included texts on Native American spirituality, and from the geometric patterns in his notebooks that bears some resemblance to indigenous symbolic systems. Yet it too fails to fully explain the specificity and urgency of the family's final actions. The land where the Blackwood farm once stood is now part of the Bitterroot National Forest. Occasional hikers in the remote areas north of the former homestead report unusual silences, places where the typical sounds of the forest suddenly cease. Forest Service rangers dismiss these accounts as typical experiences in deep wilderness, where sound can behave strangely due to topography and atmospheric conditions. Ranger David Martinez, who has worked in the Bitterroot National Forest since 1998, acknowledges the persistence of such reports, but offers a practical explanation. The topography in that region creates natural amphitheaters where sound behaves unpredictably. Add to that the psychological impact of knowing the area's history, and it's natural that hikers might attribute ordinary acoustic phenomena to something more mysterious. Yet some visitors to the region report experiences that seem to transcend simple acoustic anomalies. In 2005, hiker Jennifer Lawson documented in her journal a peculiar episode while camping near the former Blackwood property. Around dusk, the forest went completely silent. Not just quiet, but a total absence of sound that felt physical, like pressure against my ears. Then came what I can only describe as voices, though not in any language I recognized. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I packed up immediately and hiked out in the dark, unwilling to spend another minute in that place. Such accounts are, of course, anecdotal and subject to the vagaries of perception and suggestion. Yet they persist, decade after decade, often reported by individuals with no prior knowledge of the Blackwood case or the area's unusual history. In 1992, during unusually heavy spring floods, a weathered wooden box was discovered lodged against a beaver dam several miles downstream from the Blackwood property. The box, its contents, long since ruined by water exposure, bore carved initials matching those of William Blackwood. This small discovery, the last physical link to the family in over 80 years, was donated to the County Historical Society, where it remains today, a silent reminder of a mystery that has never been fully resolved. Analysis of the box revealed that it matched the description of those found in the Pentagon-arranged shelters during the original investigation. Its presence in the stream suggested that at least one member of the family had continued northward beyond the campsite, following the natural watershed deeper into the mountains. Yet, despite renewed searches of the area prompted by this discovery, no further traces of the Blackwoods have ever been found. The Blackwood Valley incident stands as one of Montana's most enigmatic historical puzzles, a case where the documented facts point to a conclusion too strange to easily accept, yet too well evidenced to simply dismiss. 5 people walked into the wilderness of their own accord, leaving behind comfort and security, for reasons they chose not to fully explain. Whether driven by delusion, desperation, or something else entirely, they vanished together, leaving behind only cryptic clues and unanswered questions. For those who study such historical mysteries, the case represents a humbling reminder of how much remains unknown even in our documented past. The archival evidence, sheriff's reports, witness statements, journal entries, tells us what happened, but not why. The precision of the Blackwoods' departure suggests intention rather than accident, purpose rather than panic. Yet the nature of that purpose remains as silent as the deep woods that presumably became their final destination. Dr. Rebecca Stern, whose interviews with Salish elders provided context for understanding the valley's indigenous significance, wrote in her field notes, "Western historical methods assume that human actions are explicable within frameworks of recognized motivation, economic necessity, social pressure, personal ambition, religious conviction. The Blackwood case confronts us with the possibility that human experience occasionally encounters something that exists outside these frameworks, something for which our analytical tools are inadequate." This sentiment was echoed by Sheriff Harrison in a private letter to his brother, discovered among his personal effects after his death in 1924. I have never fully shaken the Blackwood matter from my thoughts. Law enforcement trains us to seek simple answers: who did what to whom, and why. But sometimes I wonder if our rational frameworks are merely convenient fictions. The Blackwoods glimpsed something beyond those frameworks, something that compelled them to walk away from everything familiar. In my darker moments, I wonder if they understood something essential that the rest of us have missed. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case is what it suggests about the human capacity for shared belief, how a family of seemingly rational individuals could collectively embrace a reality so at odds with conventional understanding that they would abandon their home and livelihood to pursue it. The identical notes left behind: "We leave together so no one will be blamed. The land will keep our secret," hint at both unanimity of purpose and awareness that their actions would seem incomprehensible to outsiders. Psychologist Dr. Marion Ross, in her 1988 study Collective Departure: The Psychology of Group Disappearances, suggests that the Blackwood case represents a rare but documented phenomenon of consensual withdrawal, a group's collective decision to remove themselves not just from a particular social context, but from society altogether. Unlike cult suicides or religious migrations, Ross writes, cases like the Blackwoods involve no charismatic leader, no explicit ideology or doctrine, but rather a shared experience or perception that renders conventional existence untenable. In the decades following the disappearance, several other families left the region, citing unease with the land or disturbances similar to those described in Jeremiah Blackwood's journal. By 1920, the valley had been largely abandoned, with only a few scattered homesteads remaining. Today, the area is primarily wilderness, visited only by hikers and the occasional historian attempting to piece together its strange past. Local historian Robert Jenkins documented these departures in his 1978 book Bitterroot Exodus: The Abandoned Homesteads. Through interviews with surviving family members and analysis of property records, Jenkins identified 7 families who left the region between 1911 and 1918, all from areas within a 15-mile radius of the Blackwood property. What's striking, Jenkins noted, is the similarity in their stated reasons for leaving. Not economic hardship or opportunities elsewhere, but a consistent reference to something wrong with the land, or voices that shouldn't be there. One such account came from Margaret Wilson, whose parents abandoned their homestead in 1913, relocating to Oregon despite having invested 8 years in developing their Bitterroot property. In a 1975 interview, Wilson, then in her 70s, recalled, "Father began spending more and more time walking the ridgelines, especially at dusk. Mother would call him for supper, but he'd stay out there, listening. When he'd come back, there was a look in his eyes I couldn't place. One morning he simply said, 'We're leaving. Today.' We packed what we could carry and were on the road by noon. He never explained, and he never spoke of Montana again. For those who venture into those quiet woods today, particularly as dusk approaches, some report an odd sensation, not quite a sound, not quite a feeling, but something in between. Something that seems to emanate from the land itself, a subtle pressure at the edges of perception. Most dismiss it as the power of suggestion, the mind influenced by knowledge of the area's history. Perhaps they are right. Forest Service Ranger Michael Thompson, who has guided historical tours in the region since 2002, acknowledges the persistent reports but maintains a practical perspective. People come here knowing the Blackwood story. They're primed to experience something unusual, and the human mind is remarkably good at finding patterns, even in random stimuli. That said, I've spent hundreds of hours in these woods, and there are places where the silence feels different. I can't explain it, but I've learned to respect it. Yet the official record remains. 5 people walked into the Montana wilderness in August 1910, leaving behind a precisely arranged camp and identical messages. They were never seen again. No bodies were ever recovered. No conclusive explanation was ever established. The land, as Thomas Blackwood wrote, has kept its secret. In 2010, on the centennial of the Blackwood disappearance, the Montana Historical Society organized a symposium bringing together historians, anthropologists, psychologists, and forensic experts to re-examine the case with modern analytical tools. The resulting collection of papers, published under the title The Blackwood Mystery: Interdisciplinary Perspectives, represents the most comprehensive analysis of the case to date. Yet even with contemporary methodologies, the fundamental questions remain unanswered. As Dr. James Harrison, no relation to the original sheriff, concluded in the symposium's final address, the Blackwood case teaches us humility as researchers. It presents us with meticulously documented evidence of an event that defies conventional historical interpretation. After a century of investigation, we remain unable to definitively state what happened to these 5 individuals or why they chose to leave as they did. Perhaps some historical mysteries are destined to remain exactly that, mysteries. The files of the Blackwood Valley incident were officially closed in 1970, deemed an unresolvable historical case by county authorities. The homestead site has been reclaimed by forest, the strange camp clearing long since overgrown. Only in archives and historical journals does the story persist, a documented puzzle from the past that continues to defy conventional explanation. For those who study such cases, the Blackwood family's fate remains a testament to how thin the boundary can be between the known and the unknown, between documented history and enduring mystery. 5 people vanished into the wilderness, leaving behind only whispers of why. Those whispers echo still in the deep valleys of the Bitterroot Mountains, where the wind sometimes seems to carry voices that call from beyond the ridge, always at dusk. What would compel an entire family to walk away from everything they had built? What awaited them in the shadows of those ancient forests? The documented record falls silent, leaving us only with questions, and perhaps, if we listen carefully enough, with echoes of answers too strange to fully comprehend. In his final public statement about the case before his death in 1924, Sheriff James Harrison offered a perspective that perhaps best captures the enduring enigma of the Blackwood disappearance. Some will say they met with accident or violence in those mountains. Others will claim madness or delusion led them into the wilderness. But having walked the land they left behind, having seen the care with which they prepared for whatever journey they undertook, I cannot help but wonder if they found exactly what they sought, something beyond our ordinary understanding, something that called to them alone. The land keeps its secrets, and sometimes those secrets call to us, promising understanding beyond ordinary knowledge. The Blackwoods answered such a call. Where it led them, we may never know.